morning, everybody. I know it's early, but it's also late. We're past the time this panel was scheduled to begin. So thank you all for coming. And before we start with the panel, let me just mention that there's a lot of material on the front table about the efforts to free the Cuban Five, about the campaign, about the case. So please take material, their buttons, postcards, and other information. And it's all very, very useful. This is a complex case with many layers. So I hope that we're able to have time for the presentation and for some discussion at the end of it. My name is Nalda Vigetzi. I am a coordinator of the National Network on Cuba. The National Network on Cuba is the umbrella organization for many groups throughout the United States who do work in solidarity with Cuba and with respect for Cuban sovereignty. So enough of that. Our first presenter this morning is Michael Smith, who is also doing another panel tomorrow, and there's a flyer on that. Michael Smith and Michael Ratner are colleagues at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Michael has just published a book on killing Che, and he is going to start the program with an overview of the CIA mission vis-a-vis other countries. Michael?
Yeah. Thanks, Nalda. And Jose and Alejandro, welcome. Stan, where are you?
Here.
Thanks for setting this up. And welcome all you Irish supporters of the Cuban Revolution, particularly Leonardo. I have a feeling that a lot of you people know a lot about Cuba. Is that right?
Yes.
Is there anybody here who will identify themselves as someone who doesn't know that much about Cuba? Anybody?
Good.
Okay. You want to come closer? I just wanted to remember Len Weinglass. It's the week he died a year ago. He was the attorney for the Cuban Five and a friend of a lot of ours. And in fact, the book that Ratner and I did, Who Killed Che, How the CIA Got Away with Murder, is dedicated to Len. I think that a good subtitle to this panel would have been The Unforgivable Revolution. I think I spelled unforgivable wrong, which in itself is unforgivable. But that's what we're talking about here. With the assassination of Che, and I use assassination intentionally, assassination is a political murder. And Che was assassinated by the United States government, particularly the CIA, with the cooperation of its Bolivian client state under a military dictator they had recently put in power named Barrientos. Che was trying to defend the Cuban Revolution by extending it to other countries in Latin America. The Cuban Five were trying to defend the Cuban Revolution by identifying the terrorists in Miami that were killing people and destroying property in Havana. Jose Posada Carriles was an instrument of the CIA, a CIA agent, and one of the really mass murderers of the 20th century who goes free because of his connections to the CIA. So what we're really talking about today is the Cuban Revolution. And when I say revolution, I mean social revolution. The term is used too loosely in this country. The Egyptians did not have a revolution. They replaced one head military guy with a whole bunch of military guys. That's not a social revolution. The Cubans did something different, and they took for themselves, which was their right, their own property. And since 1959, the United States has been trying to get it back. And that's what we're talking about with the assassination of Che, with the freeing of Posada, Carriles, with the jailing of the Cuban Five. What we're talking about is the Unforgivable Revolution, where the United States wants to get back what it lost in 1959. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about Che personally and what he was trying to do and what the United States did to him and why. Che would have been 84 years old this year. He was born in 1928. He was killed in 1967. Che was born to an offbeat, aristocratic Argentinian family. His mother was 3 months pregnant when they got married in 1928. It was a scandal. The family had more blue blood than money. Che grew up in a bohemian household. He was the oldest of 5 children. The children would ride their bikes in the front door, through the living room, and out the back door. There were no fixed meal times. Friends and relatives came over at all times to drink and smoke, drink red wine. There were books laid out in magazines all over the house. They talked politics. Che's parents were anti-clerical. They were active in the fight against Franco. Che organized a soccer team when he was a kid with neighborhood kids. His entire team was made up of atheists. The other teams were invariably bigger and therefore usually won. Che was largely homeschooled because he had asthma, but he read voraciously. He read his father's entire 25-volume history of the modern world. He read Bertrand Russell, Sigmund Freud, Jules Verne. He read Mussolini. He read Stalin. He read Marx. He wanted to write a monograph about Marx. He read Lenin. He said he loved Lenin because Lenin ate, dreamed, and slept socialist revolution. Che rubbed shoulders. He got a job as a merchant mariner and sailed around and met all sorts of people on the merchant marine ships. He took that famous motorcycle trip. You remember the movie, The Motorcycle Diaries? And he went to Bolivia, where he saw the tin miners. He went to Chile, where he saw the copper miners. He wrote in his diary, because he had a habit of keeping a diary, that the Yankees have taken everything and left our people only an ox. When he came back from his motorcycle trip, he finished medical school. He passed 10 medical school exams in 10 weeks. And he went to Guatemala to get a job as a physician. His idea was that he wanted to be a research doctor and discover something that he could give for the benefit of humanity. He was in Guatemala for almost a year, never got a job as a physician. He worked as a photojournalist. He got married there to Hilda Gadea. They had a child later on. She was much more political than he was, which is often the case with relationships, and he learned from her. He was there while Arbenz was the president of Guatemala, and this is important because Arbenz made the mistake of nationalizing fallow land that was unused, that was owned by the United Fruit Company. And as a consequence, the CIA organized a coup. They got a guy named Castillo Armas, who was a retired colonel in the army and was selling used furniture at the time. And they got Armas and they set him up in Nicaragua and they trained him. Nicaragua was hospitable to the whole enterprise because it was run by Somoza's son. Roosevelt said about Somoza that he was a bastard, but he was our bastard. And so was the son. And they allowed Armas to organize a mercenary army, come into Guatemala, overthrow Arbenz, overturn the nationalizations of the land that was given to the peasants. Che resisted that unsuccessfully, took refuge in the Argentinian embassy, and then went to Mexico City. In Mexico City, he met up with a guy that he had met in Guatemala named Nico Lopez. Lopez was a veteran of the Moncada attack, where Moncada is like the second largest barracks in Cuba, and the students were trying to capture it. They didn't succeed. Many were killed. Lopez went into exile. Fidel was sent to prison. The dictator Batista in Cuba made the mistake of letting Fidel out, and he met Lopez, and Lopez said, "I want you to meet Fidel. He's coming to Mexico City." Che and Fidel went out for dinner. Che reports there was an instant sympathy between them, that he thought that Fidel was very self-confident, and that when he said he was going to go back to Cuba to fight, he would get to Cuba, and when he said he was going to fight, that he would win, and that they would overthrow the Batista dictatorship. So Fidel asked Che to sign on to the mission. Che said, "Yes, I'll do it, but with the proviso that for reasons of state, you don't keep me in Cuba. And when I want to leave to do other political missions, you'll let me go." And Fidel said yes. Che was the third person to sign on. Raul was the second. Che signed on as the troop doctor. Fidel had raised the money to buy a little cabin cruiser called the Grandma. He bought it from a Texas guy that owned this little. The whole ship could fit into this room. And they bought it. It was called Grandma because it was named after the Texans' grandmother. And 82 people got on it, and they sailed across to Cuba. They landed in Cuba in the wrong place, a day late. They were attacked by Batista, who was forewarned they were coming. They landed in a mangrove swamp, which is very hard to walk through. They were all under fire. Che escaped. He grabbed his ammunition bag instead of his medical bag, and he became one of the military leaders of the Cuban Revolution. I just got a sign that I have 12 minutes left, so I'm going to fast forward. The battle that won the Cuban Revolution was the Battle of Santa Clara, where Camilo Cienfuegos and Che, leading the troops, captured the city of Santa Clara and a big munitions supply that was on a train. They cut the island in half. Batista went to the Dominican Republic, and the Cuban Revolution began. Three laws were immediately passed. One was to lower the age so that Fidel could be the prime minister. He was 33. The second was to make Che a citizen because he was Argentinian. The third was the Great Land Reform Act, and it was a law that Che helped write, and it was a law that they learned from the Guatemala experience, that you have to give these huge land estates, mostly owned by the United States, to the people who actually worked them, who were poor peasantry in Cuba. And you have to arm these people so they can keep what they have. And you have to disperse the old ruling class, or they're going to come back and bite you. And they did that. Che served the Cuban Revolution in many capacities for 6 years. And then he went to Bolivia. And I want to finish the second half of my talk on what he was trying to do in Bolivia and what the United States did in response. Che, with Fidel's total support, thought that they might be able to get a toehold in Bolivia. Why? Because Bolivia was the most unstable government in all of Latin America. It had had 189 changes in government since 1825. The most recent being when the United States organized a military dictatorship and overthrew the democratic government of Paz Encensoro because Paz refused to isolate Cuba. The United States was on a successful effort to almost totally isolate Cuba. They got every country in Latin America and the Caribbean to cut off relations with Cuba. Every country except Mexico. But Mexico had its own independent tradition and wouldn't do it. But every other country cut off relations with Cuba. Che was trying to break out of that. The embargo against Cuba, the economic embargo, was installed 50 years ago this year. He was trying to break out of that. And he thought that if he went to Bolivia, this really unstable, weak military dictatorship, they could take power in Bolivia, and they could make the spine of the Andes like the Sierra Maestra Mountains were to the Cuban Revolution, and that the revolution could spread in Latin America, to Chile, to Argentina, to Bolivia, to Uruguay, that they would get a toehold in Bolivia and then spread it out in all directions. And that was what Che was trying to do. The United States, in the meantime, had the CIA, which by 1948 was really a paramilitary organization. It practiced assassinations. They had a doctrine of plausible deniability, a practice really, where they would do it, but they would do it secretly. And they wouldn't tell the president what they were doing. The president would give him a broad outline of what he wanted done, and then the CIA would do it. But they wouldn't tell the president why, because they, according to Richard Helms, who was organizing things in those days, we didn't want to embarrass the president by telling him exactly what we're doing. But by 1967, when they succeeded in killing Che, they had killed or tried to kill 18 different heads of state around the world. And it's all documented in killing Che. But I only have a few more minutes, so let me get to the point of what happened to Che. Che was in Bolivia for 11 months. His intent was to consolidate and train the troops he was with and then move north to a more hospitable area and begin the guerrilla struggle. He never got there. His presence was discovered in March, the presence of the guerrillas. The head of the army ran over to the American ambassador's home in La Paz and begged him for napalm and tanks and airplanes. And the American ambassador said, "Cool it, we don't want to overreact here. We'll help you, but let's do it in a more measured way or we're going to get a counterproductive problem." So what they did was they got the head of the Southern Command, a general named Tope, flew into Bolivia. They signed the contract. We got it in the documents in this book. They signed a contract where the United States would supply everything from bullets to breakfast to the Bolivian army. They would train the army. They would provide intelligence for the army. All the Bolivians had to do was supply the men and the land, and the United States would do everything else. So they started training the Bolivian army to encircle and capture the Che guerrilla band. The Bolivian army had no intelligence because it was recently established. It had been overthrown in '52, and they had no intelligence. The CIA provided the intelligence. They sent in two people. One was Gustavo Villaldo, the other was Felix Rodriguez, who you've probably heard of. Villaldo was the son of a very rich man in Cuba. He owned the GM distributorship and a 100,000-acre farm. I mean, the reason you see all the Chevrolets in Havana is probably because of Villaldo's father. In any case, Villaldo, and this is documented in the book also, Villaldo was sent by the CIA to La Paz, took his limo to the presidential palace, and he said to Barrientos, "We want Che killed. We want your word that if you capture him, you'll kill him." Barrientos replied, "I give you my word as the president of Bolivia that if we capture Che, we will kill him." We also have a document in our book written on White House stationery by Walt Whitman Rostow, who was the head of, like, they had this counter-revolutionary team of military intelligence people that had an office in the White House. And Rostow was part of the team. They brought him in from MIT. And Rostow, his brother was Eugene Victor Debs Rostow. His parents were radicals. He must have been a disappointment. And Rostow organized the American counter-revolutionary effort, not only in Cuba, but around the world. They monitored it. They reported directly to President Johnson. Rostow writes on White House stationery, "The troops that we supplied and trained in Bolivia, quote, finally got him. Che was captured. He was disarmed. He was wounded in the leg. He was taken," and I'm going to conclude with this, he was taken to a little village in Bolivia called La Higuera. And there he was put into a little mud schoolhouse, a one-room schoolhouse. Felix Rodriguez was there, dressed as a Bolivian army captain. Che realized right away that he was Cuban. Rodriguez tried to interrogate him. Che wouldn't be interrogated. Rodriguez got on his American shortwave radio. He cranked it up and he called La Paz. They had a prearranged code worked out. 05 meant Che, 06 meant save him, 07 meant kill him. He got the code back, 0507. He relayed the order to the Bolivian captain who was there. The Bolivian captain chose a lieutenant to go kill Che in the room. The lieutenant went into the room. He couldn't do it. He left. So then they got a sergeant. They drew straws. Sergeant Mario Terran drew the shortest straw. So he was sent into the room. And Che was sitting down. Che stood up, and Terran said, "Sit down." And Che said, "I will remain standing for this." Because he knew what was happening. Terran got cold feet, and he left. Fortified himself with a couple of drinks of alcohol. Came back in. Che stood up. Terran closed his eyes, and he sprayed bullets, shot Che across the chest. His lungs filled up with blood, and he was killed. And the last part of the story is this. Rodriguez and Villaldo then strapped Che's corpse onto the strut of an American helicopter, and they flew it to a hospital in a nearby town called Valle Grande. And there they put his body on a cement slab in the basement in the laundry room, and they called a press conference. And they had the press come in and view the body as a triumph. Backfired, but that's what they did. They then cut Che's hands off, and they sent his hands to Langley, Virginia, to identify the fingerprints. Because Langley had Che's fingerprints from 1952 when he was in Miami, and again in 54 when he was in Guatemala. They had been following him before the Cuban Revolution. These people are very conscious. They identified Che, and that's when Rostow wrote the memo to Johnson. I just want to conclude by reading a poem. This is a poem written by Victor Hugo, and it's about Jean-Paul Marat. Like Che, Jean-Paul Marat was a doctor, and he was a spokesman for and a leader of the Parisian poor during the French Revolution. They said Marat is dead. No, Marat is not dead. Put him in the pantheon or throw him in the sewer. It doesn't matter. He's back the next day. He's reborn in the man who has no job, the woman who has no bread, and the girl who has to sell her body, and the child who hasn't learned to read. He's reborn in the unheated tenement, in the wretched mattress without blankets, in the unemployed, in the proletariat, in the brothel, in the jailhouse, in your laws that show no pity, in your schools that give no future. And he reappears in all that is ignorance, and he recreates himself from all that is darkness. Oh, beware, human society. You cannot kill Marat until you have killed the misery of poverty. Viva Che. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Before I introduce our next panelist, Jose Pertierra, who represents the government of Venezuela in its efforts to extradite Jose Posada Carriles, I wanted to just mention a couple of things about the terrorists, Jose Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch. They were both educated at the School of Americas. They were financed by the CIA. They are CIA operatives. They have been supported, protected, as I said, financed, encouraged, and given assignments directly by the United States. And this went on for decades. Two activities that Posada is directly involved in and has directly accepted responsibility for, it were the 1976 bombing of a civilian Pavada airliner that was returning from the Pan American Games. And who was on that plane? As I said, it was a civilian plane, and the entire Cuban junior fencing team was on that flight. And they were returning to Cuba with their medals that they had won at that athletic event. And that's who he killed. In 2000, the Ibero-American Summit was taking place in Panama, and heads of state from around the world were attending that. Just off the coast of Panama, a boat was intercepted. with very powerful C3 explosives, enough to blow up the whole convention center. Sort of like this, and everybody there would have been killed. All the presenters, heads of state, students, people like you and me. The reason that boat was intercepted with Posada on board was because of information that was furnished by Cuban intelligence agents. They were there to protect the lives of heads of state and ordinary people like us in this room. And these perpetrators are the people that the United States has protected. The FBI itself called Bosch the most dangerous terrorist in the world and suggested that he be deported. Rather than that, Bush Sr. pardoned him. He walked in the streets of Miami, where even a street was named after him, until the day he died, and proudly accepted responsibility for what he did. So with that long introduction, I'd like to introduce Jose Pertierra.
Thank you. I do, like Michael, like to stand up when I talk, because they taught me that in school. I don't know why, but I can't speak sitting down. I was born in Cuba. Came to the United States when I was like 10 years old, because we weren't fleeing communism. My mother was fleeing from her mother-in-law. She hated Armenia. Never could say it. Always said Armenia. And when we arrived in Miami, as most Cubans do, we went to the offices of the U.S. Refugee Service, and we met a nice American gentleman who worked with the Immigration Service, who explained to us about a program that existed back then in Miami that would fly a Cuban family one way anywhere in the United States as long as they promised not to live in Miami. Even then, back in the early 60s, the U.S. government was concerned about what would happen to Miami if all these right-wing Cubans were to establish residency there. So when my mother heard about that, my father was out looking for work, so I was with my mother and my sister. The man put out a big map of the United States on the table, and Miami was here where I'm standing. And she looked way to the other side, and she said, Jose Ignacio, what is the name of that town over there? I looked and I said, Los Angeles. And she said, dile al americano que vamos para allá. Tell the American we're going there. So I grew up with Cesar Chavez and not with Mascanosa. And for that I'm glad. And now I live in a suitcase between Washington, Caracas, and La Habana. But I come here to talk about Posada and about the Five. You know, the thing that strikes me about all this U.S.-Cuba conflict and the Miami-Cuban conflict with Cuba is the amount of hatred that is generated by Miami Cubans and by the right-wing people. You know, we don't hate these guys nearly as much as they hate us. I spent 4.5 months in El Paso recently when Luis Posada Carriles was being tried for immigration violations. I was in the same hotel as Posada and his cronies. Got my life threatened. I saw him every day. He didn't threaten my life, but his father was there. I went to the courthouse every day, and it was unbelievable the amount of hatred and venom directed against me by people that I should be hating for all that they've done. I remember one time I got on the elevator, and Posada was there, the lawyer for Posada was there, the lawyer's wife, who hates more than all of them put together, was there, and he looked at me with venom in their eyes, and I had to say, well, I'm not the terrorist. You know? But that is the reason why they have murdered, since the advent of the revolution, almost 2,500 Cuban citizens, and why they have maimed over 2,000 others, and why they blew up an airplane with ordinary citizens, with young kids who were members of the fencing team, with a little girl from Guyana who was only 9 years old, who people forget about, but she was 9 years old. Her name was Sabrina, and she was blown to smithereens in this plane. I've been representing the government of Venezuela to try to extradite him. But really, the most interesting thing is how this whole thing was concocted. It was a conspiracy by Luis Posada Carriles. By the way, his name is Luis. Luis Posada Carriles, Orlando Bosch, and two Venezuelan henchmen who confessed. You know, the two Venezuelans confessed, they haven't been trained by the CIA, having been trained by the Venezuelan secret police as well in the use of explosives, and having worked for Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch. This last year marked the 35th anniversary of the downing of the plane. The plane was down in Barbados, off the coast of Barbados. I was there for the 35th anniversary. It's right off the coast. A bay called Deep Water Bay, because the water is so deep. When the plane went down, it's still buried underneath because it's so far down, even though it's right next to the beach. There were 73 people on board, 24 of them members of the Cuban fencing team. 58 of the 73 were Cubans, so Cuba put up most of the dead. There were Guyanese on board, there were Koreans on board. These guys were paid $25,000. These Venezuelans who put the bombs on the plane. $25,000 by their own admission. The way it happened was they went on board the plane in Trinidad and they placed two bombs, one underneath a passenger seat where Freddy Lugo, one of the Venezuelans, was seated, and it was in a camera. The other in a tube of Colgate toothpaste in the rear bathroom of the plane. And it was C4 plastic explosives. You can't get that at the hardware store. It's usually an explosive that governments have, but hardware stores don't. The plane landed in Barbados, and these two gentlemen got off, leaving the bombs behind. The bombs were timed to go off. When these two Venezuelans confessed, they even drew a diagram of the detonator with different colors on it, showing how long the bombs had before they would explode. When the plane took off again in Barbados, the first bomb exploded underneath the seat that was then being occupied by little Sabrina. That bomb caused a great deal of smoke in the cabin. And we hear the cockpit recordings, and we hear the pilot and the co-pilot trying to stem the smoke so they could see and pilot the plane back to safety. They could still navigate the plane. They asked that the door be closed to the cabin to try to keep the smoke out. They asked for permission to return to the airport. It was granted to them. And the plane banked off in the direction of the airport. And right above a beach ironically called Paradise, the second bomb in the rear bathroom of the plane exploded. And that rear part of those planes controlled the navigation of the plane. And that's when the plane went way up in the air and then back down again into the waters. Had it crashed on the beach, a lot of people would have been killed. It crashed right in front of the beach. A lot of people saw it crash. I talked to a witness, a man who had been water skiing nearby. And he, at that moment, was putting gas in his boat when he saw the plane go down. He was the first on the scene. And he told me he saw two torsos without legs, and he saw several legs floating in the water. He helped gather the debris, not the body parts, but the debris. And an investigation ensued. The two guys who set the bombs got scared. They saw what had happened, and they fled Barbados. They got on a plane and went to Trinidad. One of them had used a false name to get on the plane. So authorities began tracking them, and they looked kind of suspicious even in Trinidad. So folks called the police. Before the police arrived, they contacted Caracas. They called Posada Carriles several times. Couldn't get through to him. Talked to his secretary, Celia Toledo, and told her that in code, the bus is down and the dogs are dead. The dogs being, of course, the passengers, the bus being the plane. They asked for help. They asked to be taken to the American Embassy, and then they didn't go for some reason. But they asked the taxi cab driver to take them to the American Embassy. Why? You can only guess. They were then arrested, and the best investigation in this whole case was carried out by a police official in Trinidad named Dennis Ramduar, who got the confessions from him. And these guys, you know, they said exactly what had happened, why it happened, where the conspiracy took place. And Venezuela immediately arrested Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch, who were at the time in Caracas. There began a long trial on for these guys. First, they were tried in a military tribunal, and that was not an appropriate forum because this wasn't a military crime. These guys were not military, and then the case was shifted to civilian courts. The two Venezuelans were given 20 years or convicted. Freddy Lugo, one of the Venezuelans, is now driving a taxi in Caracas. Hernan Ricardo was released and has disappeared from sight. The last trace we have of him is a Miami Herald story about 5 years ago that said he had been working undercover for the Drug Enforcement Administration in southern Florida. Their confessions are really interesting because they not only draw a diagram of the detonator, they draw a diagram of the terrorist organization that they were working for, called Cuba. And at the diagram, it's very interesting because they have executive committee or executive commission of Cuba, and then arrows as to who they answer to. And the arrows point to CIA, FBI. This is not drawn by Venezuelan or Cuban intelligence officials. This is drawn by the people who placed the bombs on the plane. There were declarations against interest, you call them in the law. Orlando Bosch, after serving many years in jail, was released on a technicality and came to Miami. Posada Carriles escaped. He escaped. He tried to escape 3 times. The third time he was successful. He, after working for the death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador and trying to blow up an auditorium full of students in Panama in 2000 with over 100 kilos of C4, he eventually made it to the United States in the year 2005 in the spring on a boat called the Santrina. That's when Venezuela asked for his extradition. He asked for his extradition based on the extradition treaty between Venezuela and the United States that dates all the way back to 1922, where the #1 extraditable offense is murder, and he was wanted in Venezuela still for murder. He had a pending trial before his escape. We asked for his extradition also based on 2 international conventions dealing with the protection of civilians from acts of terrorism. One dealing with civil aviation called the Montreal Convention, and the other one dealing with the protection of civilians against terrorists who use explosives. The international conventions say very clearly that if the country that has the fugitive is not willing to extradite him, it shall, I mean, if anybody knows anything about the law, when you hear shall, it means there's no discretion. It shall prosecute the crime as if the crime had occurred in the territory where the individual was found. So the United States should either extradite him or try him. And it has done neither. What it tried him for was for lying. Lying to the Immigration Service on immigration forms. That was the 4.5-month trial in El Paso, Texas, that I attended. During that trial, a lot of things came out, and one of the most interesting things that came out was the lawyer, the prosecutor for the Department of Homeland Security, who had prosecuted the case originally against him on immigration charges, testified in this case. And on direct examination from the Department of Justice lawyers, she said that when she got Posada Carriles' file, she saw that he was more than an immigration violator. that he was wanted for terrorism and murder. So she went to the assistant U.S. attorney in Miami, because this case was being done out of Miami. She went to this woman and she said, why are we doing a deportation case against this guy in El Paso, Texas? Why aren't we prosecuting him for murder? And the woman refused to do it. The woman prosecutor, the assistant U.S. attorney, is a woman by the name of Carolyn Heck Miller. Carolyn Heck Miller is the lead prosecutor in the case of the Cuban Five. The woman who prosecuted and is still prosecuting zealously the case of the Cuban Five, who refused to prosecute the case of Posada Carriles. That's not something Cuba has said, that's not something Venezuela has said, that's something the Department of Homeland Security has said in open court under oath. It's very interesting. Anyway, Posada Carriles is the emblematic terrorist, but not the only one, who has been engaged in acts of terrorism against Cuba since the advent of the revolution. To combat that terrorism, the hatred, the indiscriminate murder of innocent civilians, of children, Cuba asked repeatedly the FBI to arrest the terrorists. And repeatedly the United States refused. Cuba, maybe innocently, say some people, maybe not, decided that they would send agents of Cuban intelligence to the United States, not to penetrate and gather intelligence from the U.S. government, not to obtain classified information, but to penetrate the Cuban-American right-wing terrorist groups in Miami that were carrying out this violence in violation of U.S. and international law, but also U.S. law, with the hope that the United States, with the evidence in hand, would arrest these folks. Fidel Castro, the very famous anecdote that he told about in a speech he gave a few years ago, Fidel Castro tells how he approached Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a Nobel Prize winning author from Colombia, and gave him a handwritten letter to hand President Clinton, telling Clinton that Cuba wanted cooperation in this fight against terrorism and about the evidence that Cuba had gathered on these individuals. And Garcia Marquez tells how he couldn't talk to Clinton, but he got to see Mac McClarty, the chief of staff for Clinton, who told him, we have an enemy in common, namely terrorism. We can work together. And in an unprecedented meeting between FBI agents and Cuban intelligence officers then occurred in Cuba. And Cuba gave the FBI a lot of information, a lot of evidence. They also gave the New York Times a lot of evidence. The New York Times didn't publish the story, and the FBI didn't arrest the terrorists. What they did was they arrested the Cuban intelligence agents who had come to the United States to penetrate these terrorist groups. And in a trial that was celebrated in Miami, a city filled with hatred against Cuba, a city where nobody who has any relation to Cuba can ever get a fair trial. These 5 men were convicted and sentenced to very long prison sentences. One of them, Gerardo Hernandez, was given 2 life sentences. All of them but one are still in jail, and they're going to be in jail a while. They've been in jail now 13 years. The one who was released, Rene Gonzalez, is free, but under supervised liberty, supervised probation, which means he can't go back to Cuba. He can't go back and be with his family. He can't go back to be with his sick brother who's very, very sick with cancer. He can't go back to be with his wife, his daughters. He is obligated to remain in the United States and in southern Florida specifically, which is incredible because, you know, they have it out for this man. This man penetrated their organizations. He's a dangerous terrorist. And the United States is forcing this man to remain among these terrorists irresponsibly, I think, because should anything happen to him, it is the responsibility of the United States government, not simply the terrorists who would do a terrible act against them. I read the decision of the court, which I think will be reconsidered eventually, but the decision of the court not giving him permission to return to Cuba said that it's necessary that René first establish that he has reincorporated himself into U.S. society and is taking vocational training classes and so forth. Well, this man in his motion said he doesn't want to live in the United States. He wants to return to Cuba to live. He doesn't care if he ever comes back to the United States. So it's a decision based on a number of flawed major premises. The latest thing is he asked for permission to go back to see his brother, who's as I said, he's got cancer in a very bad way, maybe dying. And the government recently opposed that motion. They left a window open saying, well, if they granted, these are the conditions, but we oppose it. I'm going to close, not with my words, but with their words. When they were sentenced, these men stood up and for the first time really spoke to the court and to the American people. And I'm going to read you excerpts, brief excerpts of what each of them had to say. Head out of it. I want the gentlemen of the prosecution to know that the only blood there may be on these hands is the blood of my brothers and sisters who have fallen or been cowardly murdered in the countless acts of aggression and terrorism perpetrated against my country by individuals who freely walk the streets of this city today. And it is for this blood that I made the pledge to sacrifice even my own life, if doing so could protect my people from such crimes. Ramon Lavanino says, gentlemen of the prosecution, and it's good to remind Americans of this, excuse me if you're American, but it's good to remind you of this. Whether you like it or not, Cuba is an independent and sovereign country. That means it doesn't belong to the United States. You hear the language that Americans, even good-hearted American people, tell you when they refer to Cuba and other countries in the world. It's almost the same kind of vocabulary parents use with their children, you know? Well, they're not behaving. Cuba is an independent country and it does not belong to the United States. Ramon says it has its own legitimate government, its own president, its own martyrs and heroes, and its own convictions. Cuba is not different from the United States, and gentlemen, Cuba must be respected. This has been a political trial, he said, therefore we are political prisoners. Tony Guerrero, Miami is an impossible place for justice. This has been above all else a political trial. Fernando Gonzalez, I sincerely trust that one day Cuba will have no need for people like me to come to this country voluntarily and out of love for their country and their people to fight against terrorism. René Gonzalez, I love this one. He says, go back to Mark Twain and forget about Rambo if you really want to leave your children a better country. They've been convicted. The Supreme Court denied cert. There's petitions pending. I don't think legally they're going to win, but politically they will. Politically they will win the same way that the Puerto Ricans who were in jail in the United States for so many years, Lolita Lebron, Rafael Cancel Miranda, and others, the same reason why the United States decided to swap them in 1979 for people who were in jail in Cuba, American intelligence agents in Cuba, those are the same reasons that will affect the trade today. The same reasons why back in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson exercised executive clemency on hundreds of socialists and peaceniks and religious leaders who had been imprisoned and sentenced to long prison sentences. And after the war, President Wilson not pardoned them, gave them executive clemency and let them go home. There's a marvelous New York Times article from 1919 where they cite the spokesman for the Department of Justice saying, back when those sentences were handed out, there was a war going on, and passions were heightened. The war is over, and it's now time to move on. And I hope that's what will affect the release of the Cuban Five. Thank you.
Thank you. As was just said, this was a political trial. It remains a political case, and it is political activity, political demands that will free them. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about some actions that are taking place where we can all get involved and demand their freedom. To give you a little idea of what the atmosphere was like at the time of the trial, as was said, the Cuban Five were sent to the United States to monitor terrorist groups. When they were apprehended, based on evidence that the Cubans themselves gave to the FBI in the mistaken notion that the United States would act to arrest the terrorists, they found nothing that in any way indicated any involvement in monitoring U.S. government activities. All they were doing were monitoring terrorist organizations. And these terrorist organizations, starting in the 1990s when Cuba redirected its economy towards tourism, they redirected their terrorist actions towards the tourist section. They were bombing hotels, restaurants, beachfront properties, etc. An Italian tourist was killed. Those responsible said that was unfortunate. In addition, at the time of the trial, during the trial, and at this time, and you're going to hear a lot of most, firsts, largest, longest, and those aren't exaggerations. These are all true. And when it comes to Cuba, there are no exaggerations that can fully describe the degree of animosity held in the United States towards Cuba as a good example. You know, Cuba sends doctors around the world. Cuba educates U.S. students to become doctors. Cuba offers help to earthquake victims. Cuba offered to send doctors to New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina. In any event, during the trial, which took place in Miami, we've heard about the atmosphere in Miami, but on top of that, this was during the time that Elian Gonzalez was being held in Miami. So all of this furor was even more heightened. To talk about the case of the Cuban Five now, I would like to introduce one of the ambassadors from the UN mission here in New York from Cuba, Alejandro Nunez. And thank you very much for being with us, especially on short notice.
First of all, let's clarify, I'm not ambassador. I'm one of the Cuban mission consul to our United Nations organization.
But one day you will be.
I don't need to be an ambassador taking with this three speaker that probably did my work in advance. Yeah, I really got to say start with the word of gratitude to the university and Led Forum organizing committee to invite us to participate in this initiative to bring the Cuba debate to this meeting that give us the opportunity to share with you some of the thoughts and policy concerning on one of the most important issues of the United States and Cuba agenda. Unfortunately, I had the responsibility to report that we were not supposed to be the speaker at this workshop. We were registered as public. I was supposed to be on that side and not in this. But two other Cuban officials from our intersection, people who are specialized on bilateral affairs, worked hardly during many weeks to present to this forum, and despite their timely request to the U.S. government to attend this event, permit was not granted by the State Department authorities. So yesterday night, they called me and asked to our mission to the United Nations to fill the space and so far fulfill her commitment to speak on this important meeting. That's why I'm here. It could be, I feel a little bit pressure because the two professors that precede me have gave you a wide and profound vision of the issues that my presentation maybe could be bore you, but I'm ready to answer whatever about Cuba and about the issue. To approach the subject on U.S. terrorism against Cuba, it is necessary to say that since 1959, as soon as the revolution triumphed, Cuba has been subjected to any kind of terrorism: sabotage, violent attack, biological warfare, psychological campaign, and military threatening, not only inside our borders, but also outside, in any facility of Cuba abroad. A long account of violent attacks carried out against a country with its population is 27 times smaller than US one. A terror war was designed to spread terror among civil population that has resulted over 3,400 people dead and more than 2,100 injured and disabled. All these actions were perpetrated by anti-Cuban terrorist groups based in U.S. territory, mainly in southern Florida and here in New Jersey. According to declassified U.S. documents and other sources, following the Bay of Pigs defeat, the U.S. government gave the go-ahead to a covert operation named Mongoose Operation and set forth the largest CIA station on U.S. territory to deploy covert activities to destabilize Cuban revolution. This state terrorism involved 600 U.S. officers of the company, which operated out the Jimmy Wave base in Florida and command around 3,000 or 4,000 agents working on the daily basis against Cuban revolution. You could imagine. To quote one of the sharpest examples that have been explained widely here, in October 6 of 1976, a bomb exploded aboard a commercial Cubana de Aviación Airliner, destroying the plane in the mid-air between Barbados and La Habana, killing 73 persons, including the Cuban fencing team. The mastermind behind this horrendous attack were two men of Cuban origin, supported by CIA, who created the CORU, a terrorist group that had met before in Bonao, Dominican Republic, to plan this bombing and among other criminal actions. According to these declassified documents, the Intelligence and Research Office from the Department of State, dated on October 18, 1976, the U.S. government knew about this act. A source quoting Luis Posada Carriles reported some weeks previous that, I'm quoting, "Now that our organization has come out to the Letelier job looking good," referring to the murdering of Letelier and Ronnie Moffitt in Washington, "we are going to try something else," said Posada. A few days later, allegedly said, "We are going to hit a Cuban airliner, and Orlando Bosch has the detail." Everything is well known. Interviewed by a Venezuelan journalist later, he proudly admitted, "We bombed the aircraft, so what?" And in 1998, in this city, the New York Times interviewed Posada Carriles, and he said, "The CIA taught us everything we know: how to use explosives, to kill, to make bombs. They trained us in acts of sabotage." It was in 1998. Another close example, coincidentally, one September 11, but in 1980, Felix Garcia Rodriguez, a young Cuban diplomat, working here when I'm working now at the United Nations Mission, was shot and killed in New York streets, not far from here, on the other side of the East River, in Queens Boulevard and 58th Street, Woodside, Queens, New York. He was shot by a New Jersey-based terrorist named Eduardo Arocena as part of Omega 7 terrorist group. A bloody terrorist who also attempted against Cuban ambassador Raul Roa, bombed the Cuban mission at the United Nations, bombing an sports store at Lincoln Center, bombing an office of JFK Airport, among other 11 acts of terrorism. In 1984, a federal grand jury in Manhattan, prosecuted by a very well-known attorney, Rudolph Giuliani, then district attorney at New York Southern District, indicted him, calling that Arocena was the worst he had ever seen. In spite of this file, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the former senator of Florida State, now a congresswoman and president of the Committee of International Affairs of the House, campaigned in Florida to free Orlando Bosch and this Eduardo Arocena. In the early 90s, Cuba began a process for developing. I'm just quote these two examples. There are a lot of examples. I brought a book, which is Cuba, the Untold Story. This book has photos of all these criminal acts of terrorism against our country since the very beginning of the revolution up to the five, which are here. And I recommend you to consult it. I will not explain every example. It would be, imagine, 50 years of attempting, including more than 600 attempting against Fidel Castro's life. He is in the Guinness record. We have recognized more, the authorities have publicly recognized more than 600 attempts to his life. More than one attempt monthly since the revolution triumphed until he was the Cuban president. Imagine what does terrorism means against Cuba all this year. But just to bring to the 90s, as Cuba began a process for developing the tourist industry, soon after the anti-Cuban terrorist group in Miami planned actions in order to destroy the Cuban tourist infrastructure and discourage tourists and foreign investment from visiting the island, participating in the Cuban market. In September 4, 1997, as part of that plan, a bomb exploded in the lobby of Hotel Copacabana, killing Fabio Di Celmo, a young Italian tourist. The same day, other bombs went off in La Bodeguita del Medio restaurant. Maybe some of you have been to that restaurant. Cuban authorities arrested Raúl Ernesto Cruz León, a native from El Salvador, who confessed to having been paid thousands of dollars by anti-Castro terrorist group based in Miami to plant bombs in tourist area. Due to this situation, Cuba had to organize its self-defense against terrorist attacks. Then Cuba sent the Cuban Five to Miami to monitor the organization responsible for those attacks and to warn Cuba of their aggressive intentions. The Five were able to establish evidence implicating specific Miami terrorist groups and individuals in the attacks. In 1998, Fidel Castro sent a personal emissary to Washington to deliver a handwritten note to President Bill Clinton, asking that the United States indeed and prosecute those who committed crimes against Cuba. In his letter to Clinton, among other things, Castro said, "If you really want to do so, you can put a stop to this new form of terrorism. It is impossible to stop this terrorism without United States involvement. Unless it is stopped now, in the future, any country could be victimized by this new terrorism. President Castro's personal emissary, as has been said, was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. In the wake of Garcia Marquez's visit, the United States sent an FBI team to Havana a month later to discuss collaboration with Cuba on a stopping act of aggression emanating from Miami. At the meeting, Cuba handed 64 files containing the result of its investigation into 31 different terrorist acts and plans against the island in the decades of the 90s. The Cuban government enclosed detail of operations against Cuba, including photographs and explosive used by terrorists. As a result of this conversation, Cuba waited for the FBI to start arresting the architects and of these operations, but instead, on September 12 of 1998, it arrested the Cuban Five, who infiltrated several terrorist groups to gather evidence of their actions, but they are really anti-terrorist fire. After their arrest, the Five spent 17 months in solitary confinement cells, in spite of the vigorous objections raised by the Five defense, as is mentioned. A trial took place in Miami, Florida, a city that is home to several anti-Cuban organizations with a long history of hostility toward the Cuban government, an environment that the U.S. Federal Courts of Appeals would later describe as a perfect storm of prejudices, which in this area prevented the holding of a fair trial. Each and every one of the 12 members of the jury selected to try the case expressed negative opinion regarding the Cuban government and was a hostile jury member. The 3 potential jury members who expressed a neutral stance toward Cuba were disqualified by the government. Initially, the 5 were accused to a bad crime of conspiracy, and 7 months later, a new charge was brought against the accused, conspiracy to commit murder. This charge was brought specifically against one of the 5, Gerardo Hernandez, the result of an intense public campaign which sought to avenge the downing by Cuban Air Force of 2 light airplanes piloted by members of the anti-Cuban group Brother to Rescue, an event that had been taken 2 years before when those airplanes were within Cuban airspace. The planes belonged to an organization terrorist. In 20 months preceding the incident, had penetrated 25 times our airspace, something which had been denounced repeatedly by the Cuban government. The downing of the planes took place after Cuban authorities had officially warned the United States that it could defend its airspace. During the trial, it was clear up that it was impossible to prove the main charge of conspiracy to commit murder and to find a single secret document involved them in a charge of espionage. They were found guilty, and they were given unprecedented long sentences and imprisoned in 5 separate maximum security prisons. 3 of them became the first 3 people ever to be sentenced to life imprisonment for espionage in United States history, in a case where no secret document was ever handled. Last September 12th, these 5 men served their 13 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. The freedom of Cuban Five is one of the most important issues in our agenda with the U.S. government. We are really interested in achieving the so-called normalization of the relation between both countries. But there won't be a solution without the freedom of the Cuban Five. They are not criminals. They must be free now, after 13 years of unjust incarceration. They use no guns. in their fight. No violence or force of any kind. They were only assisted by their intelligence and their selfness, armed only with a commendable spirit of self-sacrifice. It is quite important to say that living under this climate has been described here of terror, no U.S. citizen has ever been killed or injured. No facility, large or small, in the vast territory of the United States has suffered the slightest material damage as a consequence of any action originated from Cuba. Cuba has never offended the U.S. national symbols. Never an American flag had been burned in our country. No animosity against U.S. people is in our heart. We are a peace-loving people, educated on the principle of love and build, a people willing to normalize the relation between our both countries on the basis of respect, independence, and national sovereignty. Thanks very much.
So we're going to move on in a minute to some questions from you and also some information about what you can do, what some of the committees to defend the freedom of the five are doing now. There's a couple of websites on the board behind me where you can continue to get information. But I think it's important for us to realize that it's not just a little group of leftists in the United States who are defending the five. There's an international campaign, an unprecedented international campaign to win the freedom of the five. These convictions were appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which surprisingly declined to hear the appeal. But that appeal was accompanied by amicus briefs, 12 amicus briefs, including parliamentarians from around the world, 10 Nobel Prize winners, former officials in the Defense Department. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention denounced the proceedings. It's the only time they've ever done this. There really is a worldwide condemnation. The United States is isolated in its Cuba policy. I think that we all know that. At last night's plenary, one of the speakers was talking about how Bush was reviled wherever he went around the world. Well, conversely, Cuba is honored anywhere it goes around the world, except in the United States. And as our diplomat Alejandro alluded to, the Cuban diplomats aren't even allowed to travel within the United States. We're just fortunate that the mission was here in New York, because if we were having this conference in, say, Chicago or Los Angeles, there would be no Cuban presence because they're regularly denied the ability to travel. Anyway, to talk a little bit about what's gone on since the convictions, since the appeals, and further developments, I want to ask Stan for a little. Would you like to do a little update?
Well, I'm Stan Smith from the Chicago Committee to Free the Five, organized this workshop. I was going to talk about what was going on around the country that you could get involved in. The updates. I'll put it back to you then in a minute.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, there's Amnesty International has even come out in a statement about the case, condemning the trial and asking for a new trial. And the National Lawyers Guild has been involved in it. There's a lot of organizations involved in it. National Council of Churches, Pastors for Peace is involved in it, that organizes caravans that go to Cuba in the summer. Danny Glover has spoken out a lot about the case. Then there's the two national committees, the National Committee to Free the Cuban Five and the International Committee for Freedom of the Cuban Five. And I and the Chicago Committee have done a lot of organized workshops, like at the School of America's Watch, the U.S. Social Forum, and other events. We've had workshops. End of this week, we're working on this conference in Chicago about Alba with the Venezuelan consulate there, when having the head of the embassies from Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and then head of the Cuban intersection come and speak at this conference, along with Jose Pertierra will be there also. And also Luther Castillo will be talking about the struggle in Honduras, and there'll be some other speakers there. Next year, and in the fall, we'll probably be touring Steve Brower, who's wrote a book about revolutionary doctors, about how Venezuela and Cuba have changed the world's conception of healthcare. His book is downstairs at the monthly review table. I'm also working to help publicize this labor tour to Cuba in April. I'm going to see when Cindy Sheehan comes back from her tour talking about the Cuban Five in Europe, if she still wants to come to Chicago and organize something at the May 20 protest against NATO about getting a big contingent about the Cuban Five at that protest, unless NATO decides to run away from Chicago like the G8 did. I don't know. That's our next project to do work on there. There's also a lot of, I was going to talk a little about local committees, but I'll just say here in New York, there's going to be, there's two committees, both of them are doing workshops here tomorrow. And then there's Walter Tillow is are doing a workshop this afternoon about the new developments in Cuba with two people from the Cuban mission will be speaking at it. I did want to say another thing about, because one time when I was talking about Posada Carriles, that I didn't really know that we might think of him as what he's done in relation to Cuba, but his criminality is all over. He was the head of death squads and torture death squads in Venezuela in the 1960s. I was watching a film about it. One part, they were even trying to make one woman confess by burning her 1-month-old baby with a cigar. And then after he left Venezuela, he went and worked with the Contras in the death squads in El Salvador in the 1980s. 2 weeks before they blew up the airplane, the Cuban airplane, they organized the blowing up of Killing Pelt, Letelier and Ronnie Moffat in in Washington, D.C. They were behind the killing of the General Pratt, who left Chile after the coup. So they've been involved in just U.S. terrorism against any progressive struggle in all over Latin America. And he's still involved now. He's working now to do something to disrupt the Pope's tour to Cuba. And working with the ladies in white involved on that. So he's still active doing everything he's been doing. He's not stopping. And no one is there stopping him. About to get back to developments in the case,
yeah, there's a couple of things. One is that there have been Freedom of Information Act, the information has been disclosed that several of the reporters who were covering the trial in Miami were on the U.S. government payroll and were directly receiving funds. So you can imagine how fair and unbiased their reporting was. So that's an element that's being used now in an attempt to have the proceedings reopened. On the political side, and as we said, this is a political event, and it will take a political will to free them. In April, there is an event, or a series of events in Washington, D.C., 5 days for the Five, that will include public events, speakers, lobbying Congress, showing of films. It's very comprehensive. And you can find that on the website of the International Committee, which is www.thecuban5.org. And again, there's information on the table. And please take it. I don't want to have to bring home all this material with me. So that's a little bit about what's going on, and I'd like to have a little time now for people's comments, questions, observations, maybe thoughts about what we can do next.
I just want to throw something else into the pot. One of the things we don't talk about a lot were all of the bombings, assassination attempts, etc., of the solidarity movement with Cuba in the early 70s, including the murder of Carlos Varela in Puerto Rico, the bombing of the Center for Cuban Studies here in New York, the bombing of the Office of U.S.-Cuba Health Exchange here in New York, our receipt of letters threatening our lives. That whole other aspect of terrorist activity is somehow left out, but it's covered very well in Jane Franklin's book, The Chronology of Cuba, if any of you are interested in more details about that. But I think it ought to be thrown into the pot when we talk about terrorism out of Miami. So
Yeah,
throw it into the pot.
Yeah, absolutely. That many people, Cuban Americans as well as U.S. citizens, who have advocated something as simple as normal relations with our neighbors have been threatened, injured, killed. Thanks.
I have a question for Pertierra that has to do with strategy. As you said, it will likely be a political solution, not a legal solution, and some of us have spent time in Washington trying to figure out where the pressure points are. And that's kind of my question right now, because the members of Congress, when we talk with them for years, they said we can't intervene because it's a legal case and we're a different branch of government. Now we say, listen, the legal options are just about exhausted, so it's time for you to say something. So the ones who work with the State Department say we should go to the Judiciary Committee. The ones who work with the Judiciary Committee say we should go to the State Department. They all say Washington is deadlocked and it's really hard to do anything. They all say this is an election year and no one's going to do anything about Cuba in an election. To which we say, but that means these guys have to sit in Supermax for another year, and that's not right and it's not fair, and letting them out wouldn't hurt anybody. So my question is, do you have any ideas, because you've been in and out of Washington some, you have ideas about where the pressure points would be in the administration?
I don't have any optimism with Congress on this thing.
Okay.
And I think it is an executive decision. The power of executive clemency, by definition, and in the Constitution, is centered on the President of the United States. And there's a mechanism in place in the Justice Department. There's even an attorney in the Justice Department called the pardon attorney. And there are regulations concerning pardons and executive clemency that that the government has to go through in order to exercise executive clemency. If you go through the FOIAs that, or the documents that were disclosed through FOIAs in relation to the Carter swap in 1979 of the Puerto Ricans, that's really our roadmap. Because what happened there was Peter Tarnoff and Robert Pastor, who were Carter's aides, went to Cuba and met several times with Fidel. And they kept pressuring Cuba to release these men who were in prison who had been working for the CIA. And Fidel, to their surprise, didn't ask for anything relating to Cuba in return. He, in an act of benevolence, said, what we're really interested in are the Puerto Ricans you've got in prison for over 20 years. And the biggest problem was they couldn't be a visible link, because the Cubans considered the Puerto Ricans to be political prisoners, and the Americans considered the intelligence agents they had in Cuba to be political prisoners, but neither country wanted to admit that of the other. And I think Fidel's genius was to say, look, we will have a gesture for gesture with no link. And you see in the cables that the Justice Department and State Department released that Griffin Bell didn't want this to go through. He was at the time the Attorney General of the United States. Pastor did. Brzezinski, National Security Advisor, is very reluctant to get involved. And there was an element of mistrust. Who gets released first? And how do we make it so there's no link? And eventually what happened was the U.S. government realized that the longer they kept these Puerto Ricans in prison, the more of a hit the U.S. was taking in international forums. You mentioned that Cuba is well-liked internationally in the United States. It's not. Well, that's true. You know, and one of the problems that exists for the United States is its Cuba policy and the fact that they have these men in prison unjustly for so long. And they're taking a hit internationally. They take a hit in the United Nations and other places. So they convinced Brzezinski that it was in the U.S. best interest to get rid of this hot potato called the Puerto Ricans. And then it was a question of convincing Griffin Bell. But who pulls the trigger first? Cuba has zero trust for the United States. I don't think Cuba is going to release Mr. Alan Gross or anybody else, hoping that the U.S. after the election is going to release. So it's not going to happen. So it's going to have to come from here. And you see, the Puerto Ricans get released, and Brzezinski, in a cable to President Carter, says, "We've done our part. Now we have to wait to see whether President Castro fulfills his promise." And they went out on the air and they said, "This is a humanitarian release. They've been in prison for too long. There's no link whatsoever to anything." They denied it. Huh? Several days later, 10 days later to be precise, the Americans in Cuba get released. When they arrive in Miami, one of them, I can't remember his name now, one of them, they asked him in Miami, the press, "Well, how's it feel to get swapped for the Puerto Ricans?" He says, "I didn't get swapped, I got deported." He says, "Those guys are terrorists, I'm not." And so they denied it for years and years until these things were released. So I think in the case of Alan Gross, the United States has to realize, well, there's a constituency in Miami who's never going to vote for Obama. And there's a constituency in New York that will vote for Obama called the Jews. And they want this guy released, this Jewish American who's in prison in Cuba. So if anything, it is in the interest of the United States, to its constituents, in its political interest, to listen to the Jewish people in the United States and actually do something to release this guy. The right-wing Cubans are not going to vote Democratic. They never have, they never will. And if the United States takes this step to release Alan Gross, I am sure that Cuba will release the Five.
Honey, not all of us.
Huh?
The Jewish people. That's a little exaggerated there.
No, but what I'm trying to say is that's the natural constituency of the Democratic Party. It's not the right-wing Cubans in Miami. I mean, this is ridiculous for Obama to be worried about what's the right wing in Miami going to say. Who cares what they think?
I think if that's the advice you're giving, there is a more direct route, a more direct, more honest way to approach it. You know, the U.S. they just paid $5 million to get these people, CIA agents, out of Egypt, and they paid $2.3 million to get that CIA
Israel
agent
released, I don't know how many.
Pakistan.
How many
And they swapped 10 Russians for 4, what have you. The problem is that the U.S. has from the time Gross was arrested, the media has been bought off, been instructed to construct Gross as a basic, roly-poly Jewish chicken soup loving grandpa, not as a CIA agent, not as a CIA spy. It's only with the advent of the AP story and some others that you now have the Gross image being tarnished as he's not just helping the Jewish community, he's there on bigger fish to fry. And there are others, Cubans that are in jail in Cuba that are CIA agents, that were U.S. spies. There's one that just, was in news recently. So I think it's, a more direct way. The U.S. is not, and no government is going to leave their agents, out hanging forever. It's a Cold War concept of bringing the agent in for the cold. That's the more direct route. We ought to say that Gross was a spy. He was a spy. You know what I mean? He violated the law. But the problem is that the trial testimony has not come out. You know, what he was doing. You know, what he was really doing. You know, you now have coming out that that there are some Jewish organizations that were involved in the spying. He didn't just go to the airport and say, you want to carry this satellite phone, you know, to Cuba. The heads of some of these Jewish groups in Miami and so on, they were transmitting some of this equipment. So that story needs to be told. I mean, if we're looking, if you listen to what Smith said, what you said about the hatred that these, you know, counter-revolutionaries have, and it's not only any counter-revolutionary, any social revolution has that sort of ultimate hatred for the people that have taken their property, their country. That it's not a matter of benevolence. That you know, it's a matter of pure political calculation, and that they are waging a campaign for gross to get the Cubans, you know, and they're so they're gross about it. You know, when Renee's brother gets sick, and his lawyer files an emergency petition to the judge has yet to 3 weeks, you know, say anything. It's an emergency petition. It's not a legal document. There's not a case cited in the document, you know. And now Gross says his family, he wants to come here. They turn it around.
Yeah, but he was at the beginning of his sentence, whereas Renee has already served his sentence. So but there's still significant differences.
You know, the Cuban Five, they have daughters. Ramon has a daughter in her 20s. She's not a cancer victim. They have wives. They have children.
And that's another aspect of the case.
It's just a one-sided. You know, and this thing kind of continues to make it one-sided. Just keep quiet about it.
Except Judy Gross has been able to visit her husband in Cuba.
Yeah, another aspect is that the wives have not gotten visas to come to the U.S. and you know, the case of the five is, as we said, quite complex, and if we could focus on them without bringing in Alan Gross, because it is a different situation. But Michael wanted to say a couple of things.
Yeah, I think you have to look at Gross, the Unforgivable Revolution. He was in Cuba not really as a spy, but as a subversive. They're trying to overthrow the regime in Cuba. There's a law in the United States that calls for regime change in Cuba. They want to get back the property they lost, and they don't want to stop. You remember Thatcher's Tina, there is no alternative, Tina, you know, the Iron Lady? That's what the United States wants to do. In Vietnam, they didn't care if they killed 3 million people and they polluted that country with Agent Orange. They wanted to make sure that the Vietnamese people could not have a successful socialist revolution. And that's the same with Cuba. They want regime change in Cuba. And if they have to sacrifice some chicken soup eating guy, they'll do it. You know, they're hard. But I do agree that
the path to the freedom of the five is gross. There is no more legal path. If you're looking for these characters to be sympathetic and you know, to release, you know, that sort of thing, it's not going to happen. The path to the release of the five is through gross, is a swap through gross.
Well,
not will humanitarian, you'll do humanitarian thing, and we'll do humanitarian thing. When the U.S. government wants something, and they need to bring gross home if they're going to maintain, then the path is to swap, and we don't have to be afraid to say that. And the Cubans, that the path to the freedom of the five is through gross and some other agents that are there.
I think
that's the way you will get the.
I think what the Cubans do with Gross is their business. Mm-hmm. It's our business to expose what Gross was doing there, which was to try to overthrow the Cuban government. What we can do is expose the United States government for framing up the Cuban Five and imprisoning them. And you know what wasn't said here was the appeal after they lost to the three-court panel was won. Len Weinglass won that case. 2 of the 3 judges said you can't get a fair trial in Miami. What did the government do? I think it was a Democratic regime. They appealed it to the entire court en banc. They got 11 judges, most of whom were these reactionaries, and they won 6-5. So we won on that. I think what we can do, rather than pressure the Cuban government to release Gross, hoping that the United States does the right thing, what we could do is just expose what Gross was doing down there, but mainly talk about what they've done to the Cuban Five. It's the clearest example of the hypocrisy of this government with respect to terrorism that exists. They imprisoned 5 guys who were trying to stop terrorism. They've got no compunctions about terrorism. They assassinate people with drones. They kill American citizens, as they did 2 months ago with a drone airplane. And then 2 weeks later, they killed his 16-year-old son. And that's what we have to talk about. You know, this is what King said. This government's the greatest source of violence in the world, and we've got to go after this government, whatever regime is in power in this country. Go after this government and expose them. That's what we can do.
Okay, thanks. Another. Just a
We
second.
only got 8 minutes left.
Yeah,
So I don't know if
yeah.
anybody wanted to sign up for any, I'm gonna send this to whatever city in the US about that you're from, or get on their local lists, and if you want any stuff here, you're gonna have to get it.
And there's also postcards to send to Obama, as well as refrigerator magnets. There's a campaign every 5th of every month. And it's also, as I said, an international campaign to pressure Obama to free the 5. And the postcard campaign tells Obama, asks Obama to join with his fellow Nobel Prize winners. Another question or
I'm going to
comment?
say mine, Michael. There's absolutely no comparison between Gross and the Cuban Five. Gross was guilty and the Cuban Five were innocent. You
Yes.
can't even, they're not even on the same plane. The other path is for a movement to hold accountable the executive, Obama, the State Department, the Justice Department, the various committees and the legislature and the Congress, hold them accountable for the unlimited amount of injustices that have taken place in this case. And my question is, to Jose, was Carolyn Peck Miller, did she have any behind-the-scenes anti-Cuban connections like her husband, in the same way that John Leonard, the judge, had a husband?
Her husband was an editor of the Miami Herald.
Oh, there you go.
He passed away now, but he was the editor of the Miami Herald. And you know, one of the things I didn't say, but what happened is that the FBI in Miami had a very extensive file on Luis Posada Carriles that they destroyed the year before he arrived in the United States. And it presented quite a major problem when they even tried to prosecute him just for lying in El Paso, because they didn't have original documents. They had to depend on testimony. They brought in the testimony because they were trying to establish he had lied about paying off people to blow up hotels and restaurants in Cuba, one of the bombs that killed Pablo Lichenmo. And they brought in an accountant from New Jersey who had worked for a member of the Cuban American National Foundation, one of the board members of the foundation here in New Jersey, named Carlos Monzon. And this accountant testified, says, yeah, I took the money and from different Cuban exiles here in New Jersey, and I wired it to Posada Carriles in Guatemala, and they were able to establish that Posada used that money then to hire these Central Americans to set the bombs off, but nonetheless the jury in El Paso acquitted him of lying. I think 4.5 months of testimony where you establish through his own declarations to the New York Times that the jurors heard, because there was an audio tape of that, testimony from FBI officials, from the accountant for the terrorist organization and others. And if I'm the juror, I'm thinking to myself, why didn't they prosecute him for murder, for conspiracy to commit terrorism? Why this BS only on immigration fraud?
Because he's our son of a
I don't know. And I think the jurors, they were fed up with it. They just said, quit. So we want to go home. It was a very quick deliberation. 4.5 months of trial, they were deliberated for only a couple hours.
And after that, he came to New York, Posada, and went to our mission to Pavada.
Yeah.
We denounced to our United Nations in June of last June. He came from El Paso. He was not guilty. He's our terrorist, the good terrorist. That's why he went to put to the Brother to Rescue corner a flower to offend our mission. He's the terrorist that could be free in the United States, while Rene is submitted to a restriction and to take care of the terrorists that create the crimes against Cuba. That's the two-track policy of the terrorism of the government of the United States.
One day, every morning I pick up the newspaper in the lobby of the hotel that I shared with Mr. Posada, the Camino Real in El Paso. He loves the Camino Real for some reason, always stays in those hotels. And I stayed there because it was close to the courthouse. And this morning, it was the 10th of March. If anybody knows Cuban history, you know the 10th of March is the anniversary of the Batista's coup d'etat. El 10 de Marzo, very famous, infamous date in Cuban history. And it was a 10 de Marzo, and I went to pick up the USA Today, the only newspaper they have in El Paso. So, and I see Posada Carriles comes around the column to pick up the only newspaper there. So I go like this and I say, no, Luis, please, you take the newspaper. Then I look at him and I say, 10 de Marzo, 10 de Marzo. He said, I'm not Pakistani, because he's got a problem with his tongue. They blew half of it off, and the Guatemalans did an attempted assassination, so he can't talk. He just kept saying, I'm not Pakistani, I'm not Pakistani.
Anyway, I think our time is about over, and I hope that people found the first session on Saturday morning interesting and useful. And I'd like to thank the panelists, Michael, Alejandro, Stan for putting this together, the other diplomats from the mission, and certainly all of you for coming. And please take a postcard if you want to give it to me. I'll put a stamp on it and mail it. And anything that you can do, and take some literature, write down the websites, and keep informed about the case, because it really is shocking.